Great. So this is, the first day of Women's History Month. So we thought this would be a great program to kind of kick off the month, so to speak. Let's talk a little bit about the questions that we had that were sent to us ahead of time. Do you want to go over those? Do you have those handy?
I do. Wait, do I have them handy? No, I do not.
Well, I thought you did. A little
Sorry.
miscommunication.
All right, I get them. I've got them here.
Okay. I know one question was about somebody who had an ancestor from Connecticut who spent a significant amount of time in a insane asylum. And she was wanting to know, where can I learn more about that? That we weren't given a whole lot of specifics, so it kind of depends on the time period. Do you have anything specific to add to that, Sarah?
I'm looking at her email now. I have researched my second great grandmother, an immigrant, for years. She doesn't say where the lady was an immigrant from. It appears she was put in an asylum in Connecticut where she lived for 40 years and finally died around 1920. How can I find more about this and locate any records? Well, there would probably be state asylums in Connecticut, and there may be also local asylums that someone would have gone to. And she kind of needs to know, it doesn't sound, I don't know if she knows the name of the asylum or not. So the first thing would be to try to figure that out, and then try to learn what the jurisdiction was for that asylum.
Right. And also county poorhouses, depending on the era, would double as an institution like that. So those records might even be within a county courthouse. But if it's something that's more recent, you might have to contact the state's Department of Health. So it will kind of vary state to state whether or not you can access that. But if there is a death certificate, if it's something that's more recent and she would have a death certificate, that can offer some clues as well. Me personally, my great grandfather's sister died in the Louisiana State Hospital. There was some debate as far as like what condition she had. She died in 1947, but I ordered her death certificate and it said she had epilepsy. Now, I can't request her records. She has no direct heirs, but my mother can. So that's just because of Louisiana law. Yeah. So you have to kind of get into where the records live and what the laws look like based on the time period of the records, if that makes sense.
And we don't know, this woman didn't really post what condition her grandmother or great grandmother might have had. So we don't know whether it was a physical illness, a mental illness, or something else. She may have just been poor and in an asylum. So we don't know exactly.
Yeah.
Or elderly.
Well, and also women were sometimes put into these institutions not because they're mentally ill. Let's be honest. Back when, can't remember when I gave this program. I gave a program ages ago, maybe about a year ago, on poorhouse records. And one of the examples I recall using showed from Charity Hospital in New Orleans, and this would have been, I think, in the 1850s. It showed this one woman who had been in this institution for over 20 years before she got out. I'm surprised that she didn't actually pass away when she was there, but it said that the cause of her insanity was disappointments. What exactly does that mean? I mean, I could be, I've had plenty of disappointments. I could be put into an institution like that. It all kind of depends on what's going on in the home life. If it's another condition like epilepsy, for example, there's so many factors. Yeah, one person mentioned in the chat, I'm seeing this now, that her grandmother died in a state hospital and she was able to go there and they gave her a ton of information about the family. Yeah, it all kind of depends on the time frame of the records and the state. Yeah. Okay. So we have a question in the Q&A, which again, guys, feel free to put questions in the Q&A. That's why we're here. Okay. If a female ancestor was 15 when they married and marriage ended shortly after, would there be a divorce or annulment?
Well,
Depends on the denomination and it depends on, again, the time period. Wouldn't you agree, Sarah? And someone makes a valid point in the chat. Divorce is difficult. So putting wives in unwanted wives in asylums was an easy way out. Yeah, unfortunately.
that could dovetail.
Yeah,
between
back to the
questions.
asylums. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it depends on what state she's talking about and what the law was at that time period. And she'd really want to research what was going on in that state at that time period as far as marriages go. I would think that you would, if they were non-Catholic, that you should be able to find a divorce unless both parties kind of went on with their lives and didn't divorce and had bigamous second marriages, which we know happened at different points, because people couldn't get divorces, basically.
Yeah. Kind of on the same vein as that, and related, again, circling back to asylums. Somebody had put in the Q&A, postpartum depression, or they just wanted to get rid of someone for some reason, maybe to marry another. That was definitely a thing. So Patrick Henry, the founding father, give me liberty or give me death. There was a story apparently about his wife, who historians and psychologists now, present day, which is hard to make this assumption present day based on historical accounts, but they believe that she had a form of postpartum depression that would exhibit itself as mania. And he did not put her into an institution because the institutions would have been probably worse than the situation she was actually in. And the situation she was in was actually not fantastic. She spent years living in their basement or their cellar, in a straight dress. So there are countless stories like that. So it's something to kind of keep in mind when these various women disappear. Maybe that happened. Maybe they didn't just die. So it's sometimes worth to check unusual records. If you can't find a death record of any sort, it might just be because it's lost, or maybe she's actually in an asylum. Maybe she left the family for some reason. It could be a number of things. So one of the things I included in the handout, which I'll put another link to that in the chat, was kind of just a very basic list of tips for researching women, just kind of in general, one of which was check the long shot. Even if you think this isn't something that's going to give me what I want, look anyway. You have nothing to lose. Sometimes when you're looking at a record and you're like, yeah, this is kind of a long shot, you might find gold that way. So I just wanted to bring that up. Okay, we have a couple more questions in the chat, well, in the Q&A, I should say, which if you guys have questions for us, definitely use the Q&A button because we might lose it in the chat. Okay. What about the fact, what if a husband died and the minor children were given to guardians? New York or Pennsylvania, where in New York or Pennsylvania would you go to look for those records? What courts? Would it be under the woman's name or the deceased husband?
Be under the heirs, I believe, of the deceased husband, because the woman was not really, the mere fact that they were giving those children a guardian meant that the woman was not considered the right person to manage their property, is basically what it is. So this is for children whose fathers had property, basically,
Yeah.
or some money. And there'd be a male guardian established, usually from the family, but not always, like an uncle or something like that. And he managed their financial accounts, the financial affairs. He was not the guardian. Like, he didn't usually take them into his house. They would have been living with their mother, most likely.
Yeah, I think a lot of people sometimes hear the word guardian and think legal guardian, as in caregiver. That's not always the case.
Yeah, that's a
Oftentimes, well, oftentimes it's more like the equivalent of an executor of a trust. Yeah. But go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry.
you go ahead.
I was gonna say where you would find those records would be in the county courthouses. They might be lumped in with probate.
I think that in New York, it's called the surrogates court.
Yeah.
And in Pennsylvania, it's called the orphans court. But
Yeah.
the orphans court thing is not, is also kind of a misnomer, or people misunderstand that, because it's not just for orphans. That's where a lot of the probate matters are settled, in Pennsylvania. So when someone dies, it goes to the orphans court, or at least it did. I don't know. These are kind of archaic terms that maybe they don't use today, but certainly if you're doing research into your family's past, I think that's what they would have called it, the surrogates court and the orphans court.
Okay. I'm just saying the Mr. Rochester's attic comment. Yes. Okay, this next one might be a little bit more complicated. So this person said that their wife was born in Germany and they're trying to find information on her family, but can't find a single family member, including his wife. What is the code to break? I think my question would be, what are you looking at? Like what databases are you looking at? Because a lot of records for Germany are not easily accessible from here.
I think there's a strict privacy laws in Germany right now. So, you know, if your wife is still alive, she could probably request her own records, but she'd have to request them from the records office. There's a German word for it, and it's like city archives. So you need to find the city archives for the town that she was born in, if you're trying to get like her birth certificate. And then your wife would have to fill out all the paperwork and attest that she is that person. And I believe she would be able to access that because it's her records. If your wife is unfortunately deceased or unable to do that, I don't know if you as her husband, as her spouse, would be able to. That would be something to kind of look into.
I'm going to share my screen really quick. We had a program maybe in January where we had a genealogist who is in Germany give us a program on family research in Germany. And he does, his name is Sven Grabel. Oh, don't play. No, this is Justin Clark. Oh, I clicked on the wrong one, but I digress. He does go into where you would request those records. And I believe there was a handout to that program. So check the YouTube channel. I'll actually put the link to this particular video in the chat. And look at his handout, because it does explain where you would request those records specifically. It was a very helpful program.
So, and then if you're trying to do her genealogy, I think that German censuses and German vital records may be online at Family Search or Ancestry for the late 1800s, but I don't think I've ever seen any for the 1900s.
Right.
And
right.
So you're going to have a little bit of a gap. If you know your wife's parents' names, she might be able to request again their records from Germany, but you're going to have to kind of get through that privacy time period and get yourself back to the time period when German records are online, basically.
Yeah, someone actually
Ancestry and Family Search and those kinds of things.
Right. I love when you guys know off the top of your head the exact numbers for things. The privacy laws for Germany is 110 years for births, and marriages, it's 80 years, deaths is 50 years, we think. But double check that information. And I like that someone did bring up that the DNA thing, because I know, Sarah, you've told me about instances you know of where people would have to go to Germany, have someone test, and then like bring the test back and then get it processed here because the privacy laws are so strict.
Yeah, they don't. Apparently, the DNA companies cannot ship tests to Germany because it's against the law basically to get a DNA test. So in Germany, so one of the ways around it is for an American or somebody, a relative in another country to get the test to them and then get it back out again. So people will take tests over in their suitcases and go and swab people, apparently, and then bring them back with them to the US.
Yeah. So that's just kind of another layer to those privacy laws. But let's get back on track.
Yeah.
Because we're getting lost.
Yeah, we got to get going.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to kind of skip around because you guys have some wonderful questions, and I'm already seeing that there's over 20 of them in the Q&A, which is great. I love when you guys ask us questions. That's why I love doing these little fireside chats. So if for some reason we don't get to your question, or you have like follow-up questions, definitely send us an email. Email is your friend. We will try to help you the best that we can. And I'm going to put our email into the chat, but it is genealogy@acpl.info. Okay, let's see. Best tips for searching for women in colonial revolutionary time period. I included a book, which I don't have with me. I think you stole it, Sarah. I included the name of a book in the handout that talks about women and the law in early America. That I think is helpful for researching women and for that time frame, because one, understanding the law is important, but understanding how the law pertains to women especially is how you're gonna more likely be able to find things. Another good book, which, let me actually pull up the handouts because I'm blanking on the name of the one that I was talking about. Yes, it's called Women and the Law of Property in Early America. It's by Marilyn Salmon. So that is in the handout, which I will put a link to that in the chat again, just so you guys have it.
The one that I stole, I think, it's called America's Women in the Revolutionary Era, 1760 to 1790. It was edited by Eric Grundset. And I can put that title into the chat for you people.
Yeah. And another book, which is a phenomenal guidebook for doing women's research in general, is The Hidden Half of the Family, a source book for women's genealogy. It's by Christina Schaefer. I have this in the handout as well. It's a phenomenal book. It's broken down by state, it's broken down by time period. It has stuff relating to, just kind of casually flipping through this, it has stuff relating to private land claims. I saw something, women born in the US who lost their citizenship, Chinese American women, Japanese American women, passenger arrival records. So like tips on finding women in federal records, which you guys probably can't see. This is a great book. I would definitely recommend trying to find it somewhere. Somewhere where you can interlibrary loan it if you can't get a copy for yourself, or if you can't come in here and look at it. Look for it.
I see that a couple people are putting up questions about how they can't find a marriage record, and then they're wanting to know if that means that their ancestors weren't really married. What do you think about that?
Not necessarily. It could mean they just got married in another county or even another state. It could be that the record set you're looking at is just incomplete.
Or there could be record loss, like in
right.
that county, the marriage records burned or something like that.
Right. Or it could be, you could be right, it could be that they just never got married. So for example, my great grandmother, she was, well, great-great-grandmother, excuse me, she was Catholic, and her common law husband of sorts was Protestant, and this was Ireland in the 1880s. I have yet to find evidence that they actually got married. And the more I look, and my aunt has been looking for over a decade, we don't think that they actually were. At a certain point, Robert Hodges, her husband, or at least the father of her children, he left Ireland and moved to England, married another woman, had a whole other family, leaving behind my great-great-grandmother and her 2 children. And this would have been in the 1890s. So whether or not they got married for sure, it's kind of up in the air. Does that change her story? Not really, because she was still abandoned. She ended up putting her kids into an industrial school in Dublin and then moved to New Orleans and had a horrible relationship with my great-grandfather. But that's still a part of her story. There would have been a lot of cultural strife over this Catholic woman being with a Protestant man in that time frame and where they were living in Ireland. So putting social history and maybe cultural nuances into context for the time period and for your ancestors, that might actually help explain some things, maybe why something is missing.
Now, I will say this, that a lot of people seem to think that all of the marriage records are online now, and that just isn't the case. So you always want to check with the courthouse of the place, the town, or the county where your family was supposed to have been married, because there are gaps in the online records. There are time period gaps. There are even record book gaps where they digitized somehow record book 1 and then they skipped record book 2 and then they did number 3. And so you wouldn't necessarily know that record book 2 is missing from the online. So there's all kinds of things like that. So don't ever assume that all of the records for a marriage, for instance, but any record really, is all online for the particular state or the county that you're looking for, unless you can find definitive, proof that somebody has said, like Ancestry has said, we've done all of the marriages for this place, which is kind of unlikely. So don't assume that. But yeah, Sometimes the ministers, someone put this in the chat, sometimes the ministers forgot to send the marriage record
Yeah.
to the county, in which case, you know, the minister made a note of it in his records, but have those been lost? Have they been saved?
Yeah, circuit riding ministers is what
Yeah,
one
so there's
person
lots
said.
of reasons why the marriage might not be showing up in the records.
Right. And someone else made a point of saying, like, you know, common law marriages were common if they lived in the middle of nowhere. So it might have just been a common law marriage. They were too far from the closest church. It was inconvenient. And then at a certain point, they just felt like they were married. As far as like records being, not all of them being digitized, one person actually has a really perfect example of that, saying that they went in person to the county where those records were held for their ancestor, and they had been digitized, but they missed one page, and that was the page they needed. So it's worth keeping in mind that not everything is going to be digitized. When in doubt, call these local courthouses, call your local libraries, archives, and see what's physically there. Just as a general reminder, because I just see the chat flying by, definitely put your questions in the Q&A. We're more likely to see them because you guys are having great conversations and I love it and I don't want you to stop, but I want to find your questions. Okay. Sarah, would you like to pick a question? Or are
Hold
you
on a
reading
second.
something?
I'm in the middle of typing something.
Okay. Let's see. I'm just picking one at random. Okay, any suggestions on confirming the father of a woman who was born out of wedlock? The name listed on her death is listed on her death certificate, but nowhere else, and the informant was her sister. Or would the death certificate serve as enough proof?
Confirming the father of a woman born out of wedlock.
Marriage record with the
Out of wedlock. Oh yeah.
no, of the child. Yeah, which those didn't always include the names of parents.
It depends on how far back this is in your tree. It's possible that DNA could confirm it. So if this is not like, you know, 6 or 8 generations back, but if it's more recent time period, taking an autosomal DNA test, and then working with your matches and eliminating all of the ones to the other family members should possibly illuminate that there's another family listed there. And if it's the guy that was named on the death certificate, then you know that there is a DNA connection between the two families. That would be kind of a real complex thing to try to figure out by DNA. So you might want to send us an email if you wanted some help trying to figure out how to figure that out using DNA.
Yeah.
Possibly a church record if they were from a family that was baptizing or christening infants.
Yeah.
A lot of those did give, even if, you know, the parents were not married, it would say, you know, mother is so-and-so and then father is this other guy. So that might be another avenue.
Okay. Yeah, someone makes a point to say, you know, this is going to depend on denomination as far as like church records, because like Baptist denominations didn't keep genealogical vital records. Yeah, so it all kind of depends as far as like what information is being collected. Okay. Let's see. Do you see a question that strikes your fancy, Sarah?
Well, I was looking at this top question here. Any suggestions for finding a link to the parents of an African-American ancestor who was born in Virginia in the 1840s or 50s? And the only records that she is captured on is a census of 1880 and the marriage and death certificates for her children. I don't have any bright ideas, but I thought we could address it. Do you have any bright ideas?
So it would depend on how old she is in 1880.
40 or 50.
Like, so she's 40 or 50 years old in 1880.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm seeing that now. And she can't be found in the 1870 census.
What?
So
Yeah.
there's a way of doing this that might be a little complicated to explain with what little time we have left.
Maybe she should send us an email. If
Yeah,
she
send
wants.
us an email with some more information.
Yeah, give us some more information and
Yeah, names, some dates, and we can take a look at it and maybe give you some ideas. And that goes for all of you. If you have some super specific questions that maybe we don't get to, definitely send us an email. We want to help you. So yes, I see that Sarah just put our email in the chat, but it is genealogy@acpl.info. Okay. This next question, I'm not sure if Kurt has his microphone or not. This is maybe more in Kurt Witcher's wheelhouse, but I'm going to take a crack at it. My great-grandmother was Cherokee. Oral tradition says her family escaped the Trail of Tears, forced march by hiding in the East Tennessee and or Western North Carolina area in the heavily wooded mountains. So it's undeveloped, no roads. Another family member documented the story in 3 letters filed with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, also confirming the extended family did not appear in the U.S. Census of the time when they continued to hide. My great-grandmother's father's name appears on the Miller list of Native Americans recorded as once residing in Copper Hill, Tennessee area, but does not appear in U.S. Census records. What else can I do to learn more about my great-grandmother? Okay. Well, go ahead, Kurt.
That's certainly a really fine record trail compared to what most individuals have when they're doing First Nations or Native American, that her father is on one of the official rolls. That's basically saying that at the time he was applying to be on the roll and was actually put on the roll, there was sufficient documentation to indeed validate and verify that he was First Nations, that he was Native American. So proving from him on down would be all that one is required, if that's the right word to do, to establish proof. That you find First Nations, Native Americans not listed on federal population schedules is not necessarily unusual, particularly if they didn't go on the Trail of Tears, if they decided to stay behind and either hide or try to assimilate. We know people are generally missed on federal population schedules. There were Native American schedules going on at that same time, if it's the first half of the 20th century. So there were Native American First Nation schedules up through 1935, 1940. They didn't necessarily follow the decennial pattern of the population schedules. So don't know what to advise as far as additional documentation or proof, but that's If the person appears on the Guian Miller rolls or any of the other 5 civilized tribe rolls that the federal government said, yes, these are the official enrolled people of this tribe or this band, there's your proof.
Mhm.
Great. But if you have any like additional questions from here, Gail, send us an email. We'll be happy to maybe give you some more thoughts if you have kind of more questions based on Kurt's lovely comments.
And if I could just add one more, and this is, Gail, probably really challenging. But when we're trying to discover more about First Nations, Native Americans, it's, again, really, really challenging. But every once in a while, you hit something really rich, and that is if you can find that whole fan thing that we hear about, friends, associates, and neighbors. And who are the associates of First Nations? They're what we call intruders. So if a relative is on the roll, can you find any information about the federal agents that were involved in the doing the enrollment? Kent Carter, a former National Archive chief of the Dallas-Fort Worth branch, which has a huge Native American First Nations collection. He wrote a book on all the various individuals involved. So it might be just fun to take a look at that book and say, hey, I wonder if I can discover any other federal government documents that might validate these particular individuals being enrolled on this particular role. So it's a heavy lift, but it can be fascinating to try to find the intruders, government agents, other individuals that interacted with people that are on the Trail of Tears and people that decided not to travel west on the Trail of Tears.
That's some very sound advice, and that there's I actually made a point to, when I included in the handout, some like kind of basic tips, one of which was to read accounts of other community members. So including people who might be interacting with the community, because you might end up, if not coming across something with your ancestor's name, it might just give you a better or a more clear image of kind of what's going on for them. Great.
Okay, I've got some questions here that I think we can knock out maybe quickly.
Yeah.
In my grandmother's journals, she states that she lived in foster homes up until age 13 from the years 1913 to 1926 in Norfolk, Virginia. How can I find out more about this? Well, when you say foster care, it makes me think about modern foster care, which is, you know, in each state, it's probably administered by some other agency, but in Indiana, it's the Department of Child Services. So whatever that agency is in Virginia, I would start with them and tell them that you have this historical foster care question, and they may have some records going back that far. I don't know that they do, but that's where I would actually start. What do you think, Elizabeth?
So yes, and also that time frame is just around the time frame that they stopped doing this in some states. It kind of depended on the state. You had, so as far as relief goes, so welfare goes, you will have your poorhouse, but then you'll also have outdoor relief. But then there was also another thing where they would say a family was struggling to make ends meet, they would remove the children from the home, parents go into a poorhouse, and the children be sent to live with various community members. Those records are going to live in the poorhouse.
Right.
They sometimes they're going to live within anything relating to relief in some way, anything relating to public welfare for the county. Those records might be separated out within the courthouse, or they can be mixed in with probate records. It kind of depends on the courthouse, depends on their filing system. So you could also try that as well. Unless it was something that was done by not foster care through the government per se, but maybe
Mhm.
through a religious organization. So you will see that as well. So contacting various charities that might have existed at the time. I know my great grandmother, she was born in 1912, and sometime around, I'm blanking on the years, around 1916, I believe, my great grandmother and her two older siblings were placed into a Presbyterian orphan home for children in Talladega, Alabama. After some Googling, I found out that the organization still exists, and they still had records. So they were actually able to confirm for me in the register book, not just that they were actually sent there, but also that like who brought the kids there, which was not their father, it was their grandmother. So, oh, and who adopted them and how long they stayed. So that's their religious group. So check a couple different places.
Yeah, foster care might not have meant foster care as we know it now today, but it just
Right.
depends. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Or it could just be like an unofficial, like,
Mm.
community. We're just raising this like kid type thing. It takes a village type mentality. But this was Norfolk, so it's
Mhm.
not that small. So I'm thinking probably not.
Hard to say.
It's hard to say.
Okay. All right.
Um,
My great grandmother died in her sleep, 1901, in Solvay, New York, at a friend's house. Would there have automatically been a coroner's report? I'm kind of, I imagine a lot of people die in their sleep, so I wouldn't think so, but that might be something to look into the laws at that time period. Like what were the laws in New York regarding suspicious death? Like when did the coroner have to make a report? And then you might try with the if you find out that there was a coroner's report, that there should be a notice of that in the newspaper. She mentions notice of the death in the newspaper. They would, at that time period, they would usually put an article in the paper saying, the coroner's report has come back for such and such a death, and this is what they found out. But there also should be records at the courthouse somewhere, at the current coroner's office or in a back room with all the archival records. Hard to say exactly, but you kind of have, it's one of those things where you have to kind of turn over a lot of different avenues of research to try to figure it out.
okay, how far back can we realistically look for African American women in a family line? It kind of depends, and it depends on the information you have. Some people can get pretty far back. Me personally, my great grandfather was, I'm from Louisiana, for those who do not know, from the Mardi Gras mass behind me. My great grandfather and his mother and his sister and the rest of the family, they were all considered Creole of color, so they were mixed race. I've been able to trace that family back to the oldest woman in that family, which that family is a little weird because the men kind of disappear. I'm actually having an easier time tracing the women in that family. The oldest person I can go back to is someone who was born in the 1830s. However, that woman lived to be very old, like almost 100. So I was able to find her on later records. Finding the family and things much past 1870, I should say, is a little bit of a challenge that I'm currently working on. So it kind of depends. It depends also on the state, what records are available. But if you have like kind of a specific thing you're working on, I definitely recommend sending us an email. Maybe we can take a look at it and give you some suggestions.
Yeah, and I would say that DNA might be a way to go. And I was just looking at Elizabeth's DNA, not recent, kind of recently,
Yeah.
and I told her that I thought that there were some clues in her DNA about who these women's family might have been.
Yeah.
And we're kind of pointing in the direction of a male white enslaver, that her enslaver was probably her father at some point in time. So
Yeah.
it certainly can. DNA is one facet of trying to track that down when maybe the genealogical records aren't there.
Yeah. So definitely send us an email with more details about what you're working on, and maybe we can pick at it, come up with some more specific ideas for your problem. Yeah, someone actually just put in the chat, through DNA matches of their African American family, they found a branch that can go back to 1805. So yeah, it all kind of depends. Okay. Where would I find birth, death, marriage records for a family in Craighead, Arkansas, 1885 to 1900? Well, I do not know off the top of my head where you would find those specific records for Craighead, Arkansas, partially because I'm not entirely sure where in Arkansas that is. I would suggest looking at the Family Search Research Wiki. So let's see. I'm going to pull it up and then I'll share my screen. Okay, so for those who have maybe not used the Family Search Research Wiki, it's like Wikipedia for genealogy on steroids. It's great because it'll have information for all kinds of stuff. You'll have it for individual counties like this one. You'll have pages regarding, well, I actually included a link to a page on like best websites for researching women. I included that in the handout. This will give you things like dates, known beginning dates for major records, birth, marriage, death. It'll say if there was record loss. So all records were destroyed by a fire in 1869 and then again in 1878, which for what you're looking for, you should be good. And then if you scroll down, you'll have links to where you can find different things. Some of it will be on Ancestry, some of it will be on Family Search or other places. It all kind of depends. So that's what I would recommend.
I think the time period that she's looking for, I don't think Arkansas was keeping birth and death records. And so she's going to have trouble finding like an official birth certificate or an official death certificate. She's going to have to branch out and look at other types of records that can substitute for those records, like a christening or a baptism for an infant, an obituary for a death, or maybe some probate records for a death, that kind of thing. And so you're going to have to get kind of creative.
And, you know, and I love how generous all of you are. I see that somebody put in the chat that they live in Craighead County, Arkansas, and they would be happy to help. So for the person who asked that question, if you're still here, reach out to that person and feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to kind of point you in the right direction. Okay. So we are running a little bit low on time and there's still almost 20 questions left to answer. So like I said, guys, if you have questions that we don't get to, send us an email. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info, which I just put that in the chat.
Okay.
Do you have a question, Sarah?
I was going to just kind of combine some of the questions that I'm seeing there. People are asking about how to find the maiden name of a woman. So if you don't have the marriage record, which would tell the maiden name, and sometimes there's not a marriage record that we can find that exists. 2 states that I can think of didn't keep marriage records early on, and that would be New York and Pennsylvania. And there's probably some others that I'm forgetting, or the marriage records didn't survive for certain time periods. You're not going to be able to get at that marriage record to find the mother's maiden name. Now, here's just some general ideas. You trace all of that couple's children forward in their life. So let's say that the couple who, the woman whose maiden name you can't find had 10 children that you know of. And you're, of course, descended from one of them. I would trace all 10 of those children forward in life, and I would look for the marriage records of when those children got married as adults and their death records when they died, to see whether their mother's maiden name was listed. Another thing would be their obituary. So the obituaries of the children sometimes would say, the deceased was the son or the daughter of, John Smith and Mary Brown. And then you would have that information there. So really tracking the children forward in time, or if one of the children was prominent at all, and by prominent, even if they were like a farmer that was doing okay for himself. In the late 1800s, he might have been listed, the child of this woman might have been listed in some kind of county history. And in those, they kind of recount the family history of the subject of the sketch. So if there's a sketch about the son, again, it probably would say he's the son of John Brown and Mary Smith. And he was born in such and such a state, and so forth and so on. And so those are some clues also in tracing just the children and even maybe the grandchildren of that woman forward in time. There's also DNA that could be done. And again, if you have like questions about how to apply this to your DNA, you can send us an email and I could try to help out. But that's what I would suggest. What do you think?
I agree with everything you just said, especially the last part about DNA, because I know from my personal experience, I solved a major brick wall that I didn't even know where to start with this brick wall, because I knew so little information regarding a great grandparent that was adopted, and I wouldn't have been able to figure it out if it wasn't for DNA, and then also newspapers kind of combined with that. So definitely do all the things that Sarah just said, and send us an email if you want us to look at your specific problem, and where you're stuck, and maybe we can come up with some ideas for you. I do see somebody asking in the chat if there was a way to save the chat. To get a copy of the chat, send us an email, which I sound like a broken record, I know. Send us an email for more questions, for a copy of the chat, and we will get that to you. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info, which I just put it back into the chat. Okay, let's see.
Then we have a couple ones that are like disappearing women, the woman was married and then they find the husband remarried to somebody else and they don't know what happened to the woman. They can't find a death certificate for her, so forth and so on. And it's usually in the time period before death certificates were kept. So it's not that maybe, her death wasn't recorded. It's just that those records weren't kept, or they didn't survive or whatever.
Yeah, I just started a case of a disappearing woman last night at 2:00 in the morning when I should have been sleeping. As I do. in my situation, this was somebody who would have died, I think, in the 1850s, late 1850s in Ireland. So my immediate thought goes to history. What's going on? I recommend, and I think I put this in the handout, try to make a timeline for the things that you know about this disappearing woman, from the approximate year you know she's born, dates of marriage, births of children, all that good stuff, and compare that with maybe a historical timeline of events going on, if at minimum in the country, if not the area. So was there a flu pandemic, right? Was there a famine? Could it be something like that? What does healthcare look like for women in that time period? Could she have potentially died in childbirth? You might not get an exact concrete answer, especially if we're talking about someone who would have died before those death records are being kept, or before they're being kept well, at least. It can at least give you some ideas of maybe what happened to her. It's also possible that she is in an asylum. Back to the theme from the beginning of this program.
Mm-hmm. Circle back.
Circle back. But there's always a possibility of, when you see this man getting married a second time, take a really close look at that marriage record, because you might end up seeing even the smallest notation that you might have missed the first time around, stating that this is a second marriage, or that he's previously a widow, or that he's a widower, basically. If it asks for condition and it says that, then she died, depending on when, is gonna be, that's a little up in the air. So that's kind of what I would.
Yeah, and I would say, I think these people we're talking about, some of the questions I saw were like 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. That's a rough time for women in this country. They didn't have a lot of rights. They didn't have a lot of, not a lot of records were created about them. And if you're searching, and here's a little tip for you, if you're searching for newspaper articles about, maybe she died and there was a mention in the newspaper,
Search for the husband's name.
She might have been under the name Mrs. Brown.
Yeah.
Or, George Brown's wife. I mean, really, with no mention of her first name at all. Yeah. So keep that in mind too, that she may not have even been given her own name in the records that were created about her death, if there was a record that was created.
Right. Because we're also talking about a time frame where women weren't actually citizens in their own right. Their citizenship was dependent on the men in their life, their husbands or their fathers. So keeping in mind, what does the world look like for a woman in that time period? That can kind of give you some ideas as to maybe why they disappear, and maybe give you some clues as to maybe where to look for more stuff.
And if she did, I think sometimes people have this idea that she ran off and started a new life, and she might have. It was more likely that it was the men that did that at that time period that we're talking about. But if the woman had done that, again, DNA might be a way of figuring it out. If she went on and had more children with another man, and those people turn up in your DNA matches, and you have some kind of conversation with them and finally figure out that you both have the same woman in your tree, and you can get the answers that way as well.
The only reason why I know, so my great-great-grandmother, who the father of her children left Ireland, moved to England, married another woman, had a whole other family, and then she moved to New Orleans, left the kids. The only reason why I know that is because she sent money to have her daughter brought from Dublin to New Orleans. And then eventually my great-grandfather, as an adult, settled in New Orleans. But it was very clear from what my father said, was that all these people lived in New Orleans together, my great-grandfather, his mother, his sister, and none of them spoke to each other, because there was just so much pain behind all of it. But that's the only reason why we knew the story to begin with. It was It was a story that was overheard late at night by my grandfather that he shared to other people in the family. And it ended up being true. But in that respect, I'm lucky that he was eavesdropping, because not everyone gets that.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's do one more question because we are just about out of time.
I was looking, well, I don't know. This may not be a good one to end on, but there's one here. Maybe we can do another two, but there's one here about that the person, Christine, gives the name of an ancestor and gives us her birth date and her death date. And says basically she just showed up in Michigan and the name is Lenore Toussaint. And so that tells me that this woman is probably an immigrant to the US, either from Canada, perhaps from a French Canadian background.
If
Or
that's her
from-
maiden name.
Yeah. Or she's possibly from Europe, from France, or a French speaking country. And this name, the way that they have it spelled here and this in the question and answer area, it doesn't look to me like it possibly is the correct, French spelling of the name. So whenever you have an immigrant ancestor, wherever they might have come from, and there's a language barrier or language difference between, what the name, how the family would have spelled the name, how they would have pronounced the name, and so forth. There's usually an American spelling and then a French spelling, or an American spelling and a Hungarian spelling.
The
And so-
spelling,
Yeah.
the French spelling of that name, I thought it was this and I just double checked it. It could either be Toucet or Toussaint, which is Tousssaint. It could be either or.
And the Lenore doesn't look right to me either. It may be, I don't know what the French version of that first name would have been, the spelling of it.
Well, that sounds more like a shortened version of a longer name.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
basically the whole point of this rambling that I just did was to say that you need to figure out, if you do know what country the person immigrated from, you need to look at some naming books, maybe some naming patterns of that particular language and that particular country of origin, and that will help you. And if this woman is French Canadian, a lot of those records are up on Ancestry and Family Search, but they are under the French spelling. So if you don't have the French spelling properly, then maybe that is the problem. Now I see on here she has that woman was born in New York, so it's possibly that her parents were from France or from Canada, but anyways, just kind of an idea of what to do, what to start to do with your foreign women, your women that came over and are immigrants.
Well, even just searching different variations of names in general, even
Right.
like just the first name.
Even regular names, yeah.
Yeah, I think
And nicknames.
Yeah, I think I put some examples in the handout of like Margaret, Meg, Maggie, Peggy, Peg. I mean, the list goes on and on. And also looking for like first letter initial, last name. So search all the name variations.
Yeah,
all of them.
So yeah, in the past, there's a couple of variations for Sarah that people might not know about. Sally and Sadie are two of those. So that aren't really very close to Sarah in spelling or, in sound. And if you didn't realize, then you wouldn't know that those could be interchangeable.
Yeah. Well, let's not even get into how many nicknames there are for Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, yeah.
Yeah. So that is it for today, everybody. We're definitely out of time. As I said, for those of you who maybe wouldn't get to your question, we tried our best. Send us an email. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info, which I'm going to stick that in the chat again. If you would like a copy of the chat, also send us an email. So this program is being recorded. It will end up on our YouTube channel eventually. So keep a lookout for that. I put a link to the YouTube channel in the chat as well. And thank you again for joining us, everybody. This was fun, and it was a really nice way to start off this month. I hope all of you enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you, Sarah, for joining me.
Yep, it's fun.
Bye.
Bye.